Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and my guest today is my good friend, David Buckland. And I say he's my good friend, not because we've grown up together or spent hours and hours and hours together, but I feel an affinity with David, and we've sort of grown close through electronic media over the last couple of years, sending back and forth tons of emails. David has helped me tremendously with the Batgap website. He's very good with technical things, but he also has a great deal of spiritual wisdom and experience. He has a blog called Davidya, which is sort of a play on words because his name is David and Vidya means knowledge in Sanskrit, so it's some knowledge from David. Although he doesn't claim to have originated it.
No, a friend of mine gave me it as a nickname, and I found out the meaning later.
Yeah. And David is one of these people who has been fairly reluctant to do an interview, which is always a good sign that he'd be a great guest on the show, because he is just, doesn't proclaim himself to be a spiritual teacher and or anything, and has wanted to keep a fairly low profile. But finally he decided to do an interview, and the context of this is that I'm up in British Columbia. We're now at a retreat place where David and I are going to be doing a retreat with Lauren and Lucia Hoff, and we're looking out over a kiwi orchard, and maybe I'll get some footage of the place. It's very beautiful. It's a kiwi lodge in near Ladysmith, British Columbia.
On Vancouver Island. On
Vancouver Island. And I always like to do interviews in person if possible, although over Skype is fine, but somehow there's just an even deeper mind meld when you can actually just sit with a person and have a conversation as opposed to doing it over Skype. At least that's what I find. So I'm really pleased to be here. And I think you're going to enjoy this interview. David has a lot of wisdom to share. So people usually like to sort of get a sense of who the guest is, what their background is, in a sense, what qualifications they have for being on the show, simply because anybody can spout philosophy. Anybody can read a bunch of Advaita books, for instance, and learn how to talk non-dual. But,
dualistically.
But, as I've quoted many, many times on the show, there's a Tibetan proverb which says, "Don't mistake understanding for realization." And it goes on to say, "Don't mistake realization for liberation." And so perhaps if we were to just sketch out the course of your path, your spiritual path, over the last decades, it would give people a sense of who you are in that respect and what qualifications you have for talking about what we're going to be talking about.
Okay. First, though, I would like to invite listeners to consider they have a choice here. You can, of course, listen with the mind and hear a person tell a story, or you can settle into a quieter space and listen from the quietness to the quietness that's there, the silence that's speaking and the silence that's listening. There's lots more magic in that part of it. Of course, if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. Just enjoy the interview. But there's that option you have for how you listen. It makes a difference. Okay, well, I guess the spiritual part of my story starts my late teens. I got an interest in consciousness and brain stuff, and I was reading up about that and started running into references to meditation, and didn't know anything about that. And then I saw a poster for TM, Transcendental Meditation, and I went out and to a lecture, and that was interesting. I didn't really relate to it too much, but the science was they had some booklet on some of the scientific research, and it I found it compelling, so I thought I'd give it a try. And on my first meditation, boom, into this really peaceful space, kind of a foggy but light space, and I was really impressed. So I pretty quickly became a keener and started going to...
A keener?
A keener, yeah.
What's that? Someone who's keen?
Yeah, someone who's,
gung-ho?
Gung-ho, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. and you know, took some weekend retreats and courses, and went to a bunch of lectures and all that kind of stuff. And I guess about 9 months after I started, I was in Northeast France and on a 6-month retreat to go deeper and learn to teach the meditation, TM.
Courchevel?
Battelle.
Battelle.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a little after your time,
Yeah.
on your TTC. Yeah, so that by that time things had shifted a little bit. It was mostly videotapes
Yeah.
from the earlier courses a couple of years earlier, like you were on. And so the first 3 months did a lot of purification. And then
What was
the,
that like?
Well,
the purification?
Well, I was an anxious kid, and so lots of anxiety pouring out, a lot of restlessness. There's a fair bit of memorization in that part of the program, and so kind of like trying to memorize while you're
purging.
Oh, that's purging. It's like, anyways, yeah, you know, it was fine though, and at a certain point, I started having little brief, clear bits where the witness kicked in, and the witness is kind of it's like an observer mode. You kind of shift into this observing, whereas you know, usual perception is you're a person here experiencing the world, but in the witnessing, you kind of take a step back and you are awareness observing the person observing the world.
Yeah, and let's just dwell on that for a second, because it's not like you're a person observing the world.
No.
It's not like astral projection where you're separating one aspect of individuality from the rest of it and standing apart. Elaborate on what is the witness?
You're shifting into consciousness itself, observing the person experiencing. You're shifting into your deeper nature that's underneath the mind and emotions and all those layers of experience.
And your deeper nature is not merely individual.
Right. It's a more universal.
It's everyone's deeper nature.
Yeah, a shared consciousness. Yeah.
Light that is one, though the lamps be many.
Yes. And so here and there, kind of came in and out a few times, and in and
out of witnessing.
Yeah, yeah.
So in other words, it would persist for days sometimes.
At that point, no, it was mostly for hours.
Glimpses, yeah.
Yeah, little glimpses here and there, but it was it was a precursor. And then in the second half, we went a little deeper, and at a certain point, we did what was called rounding, essentially, which is cycles of yoga, asanas, pranayama, and meditation.
Yeah. And if anyone remembers the song Dear Prudence by the Beatles, there's a refrain that goes, look around, round, round. Yeah. They were referring to rounding, actually,
yes.
on the course they did with Maharishi in India.
So I was on the floor, face down, doing yoga, and all of a sudden there was this brilliant blast of white light, blew out all perception, and for a moment, and then the perception started to come back again, and for a moment I could see through the floor and the wall of the room below out onto the grounds. And it was kind of like, oh, that's interesting. It was like some bit of flash, and I didn't think too much of it. And then I continued on and went to my meditation and that. But then it became apparent after that that the witness stayed, and it never did end. It never did stop after that. It became a constant background continuity underlying all experience.
What happened when you slept at night?
Well, that was kind of interesting, actually. At first, you're basically, that witness stays through waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. Mm-hmm. And so at first, I'm dreaming, and I start manipulating the dreams and that kind of stuff.
Lucid dreaming.
Yeah, kind of like lucid dreaming. And then in going into deep sleep, watching the body fall asleep and become like this immovable lump, and just basically being hyper vigilant for a few days, over observing and that. And then I realized that if I was observing the mind sleeping, the mind was still awake.
Which is the question I was about to ask when you said that.
So, it wasn't really, because there's the senses were
there's some individuation still there.
Yeah, trying to, so kind of I realized it was unnecessary and just kind of relaxed into it, and then there was just awareness. Mm-hmm. And so the body would go to sleep and the mind would go to sleep, and there was just this continuity of awareness.
So during that continuity of awareness, was it like I am aware of the awareness of the body, or was it complete, like no sense of the body whatsoever, just awareness in and of itself, by itself, pure awareness.
Yes, it was awareness just by itself, kind of behind.
Not perceiving anything, because there's nothing to perceive at that point, because the senses of perception
Right.
are shut down.
Yeah, so it's just observing. Well, observing isn't even the right word there.
It's too active a verb.
Yeah, yeah, it's just kind of like presence, you know, just, and that sense of continuity. That was the thing I really noticed, which is there was a continuity.
And let me ask you
Never
this. If it's just presence, and there's no sensory activity going on, no cognition, no cognitive functions going on, how do you even know that that presence is there? And who knows
well,
that presence
there's a
is
bit.
there?
There'll be things come up where a bit of a dream will happen, or some noise in the room will raise you up out of sleep a little bit, and then there's a little bit more going on, and then it settles back down again. And just that sense of continuity, just that sense of never, because there was a distinct shift, you know, before there was a certain style of experience, and then this is a completely different style of experiencing. And so that distinctive difference never shifted back.
So is it kind of like there's a bubbling up of some activity, some dream or something,
Yeah.
and as it bubbles, there's a realization of, oh, this presence, which is here now in the midst of this little dream, has been here previous to this, it's been here all along, but now there's some cognitive function that's just gotten enlivened, and I recognize the presence has been here all along. Is there anything of that flavor?
Yeah, kind of like that, but it's not really thinking about that.
Well, that's a
much.
big,
It's just,
long, elaborate.
Yeah. It's just what it is.
Just a recognition.
Yeah, it's just a sense of isness or being there. That's always there.
Okay.
Where before that, and it's interesting. You become the process becomes much clearer. You can actually observe the body waking up and the mind coming online, and the ego waking up, and so there's sort of the sense of me shows up again, and which is gone during deep sleep. So it's kind of interesting in a certain kind of way. In deep sleep, we're basically egoless, and it happens to us every day. But the actual process of waking up is a whole different, whole different thing.
I think
much harder to
Shankara
do
said
consciously.
something about how during deep sleep we sort of reside in the transcendent, but the vast majority of people aren't aware of it. But the enlightened maintain that awareness during deep sleep. Isn't there something? And didn't he say that that's why sleep is so? One of the reasons why sleep is so rejuvenating, that we're actually sort of resting in our true nature, albeit in an unconscious way for most people.
Yeah, and it's also useful to make a note here. In the TM teaching that Maharishi taught, was that witnessing full-time, particularly witnessing deep sleep, was the key marker for cosmic consciousness, or what is more commonly called self-realization. However, in my case, and I know several others, I didn't actually, there wasn't a liberation. There wasn't that actual shift. It was like a close but no cigar.
Yeah.
It's kind of that the witness came online, but the ego remained identified. It took me a little time to get clear about that, because I didn't have a context for it. But yeah, that was the context. And it turns out that there are some people have that kind of shift, and some teachers even, or teachings, speak of a pre-awakening stage that happens for some, where there's the witness comes online, but it doesn't go all the way. The mechanics are interesting. Kundalini Vidya tradition talks about the energetic mechanics that are supporting that. And basically, when the Kundalini Shakti rises up the spine, gets above the throat, that's when the witness comes online. But at that point, the Kundalini is still unstable, so it comes and goes. But if the Kundalini rises high enough to reach what's called Makara, which is just above the third eye, which is the white flash experience I had. Not everybody has that with Makara, but it's one of the symptoms. Then Kundalini becomes stable and doesn't go back down again, so the witness becomes full-time, ongoing.
And that's more or less what happened to you.
Yeah, and you know, just note though that that's not causal. It's not that because I reached Makara, then the witness stayed online. It's more like the energetics that supports that to continue. So the physiology can support it. Yeah. So, but I didn't discover that understanding until much, much later. And then the whole thing made a lot more sense. Now there's a very small difference, distance between, Makara and the crown and awakening. But for some people, the process pauses there for the physiology to clean out more and that kind of stuff before it moves on.
Did that happen to you?
Yeah, so that's basically what happened
for
to me.
For decades, right?
Yeah. And that's several people I know, same thing. It's but also, you know, at that point I was in my very early 20s and a late bloomer, so my physiology hadn't finished growing and establishing. So it's, you know, it was a good thing in some ways to pause, but at the time it wasn't. At the time, it wasn't you know, well understood what was taking place.
Okay.
So then, about 10 days later, I had my first what I would describe as a cognition. Now, a cognition is a kind of experience where you get a total experience. Like, say, I don't know, an object. Okay, no, I don't have one there. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But say my finger. Okay.
Well, an object is an object.
Okay, here's an object. Okay, so I'm experiencing this object here, and I see this side of the object, and I might know something about how these are made or whatever like that, some details. But when you cognize an object, it's like total knowledge of the object. You can see it from all sides simultaneously. Its entire history, its origins, the whole thing all happens together.
So, like in the case of this, you'd somehow see the metal being mined and smelted. And
okay, but in this case, it's like I'm using a physical object, and cognitions usually aren't physical objects. It's more like more subtle stuff. And so, in this case, it was what's Hranyagarbha, the Sanskrit name for the golden egg.
Golden egg.
And basically, it's the universe in seed form.
Mm-hmm.
So, essentially. So what happened basically is there's this big experience, and then it takes a long period of time. Well, it depends on the size of the cognition, but it takes a long period of time for that to be unpacked, so that the mind can digest, you know, experience the different aspects and the understanding and so on like that.
So did this cognition come in a flash? Did it last an hour? I mean,
well, it's like a door opened, and then there it was, and it's been there ever since.
I see. So it's been there ever since, and so it's there, but. You know, it took a long time to unpack and understand.
For the mind to unpack it, So the consciousness could experience it.
And why is that significant? This Hranyagarbha thing.
Well, it's basically understanding of the universe, where it comes from, how it functions, the layers of its expression. And,
okay, so an obvious question here would be, where's it come from? What are the layers? I mean,
well, that's a whole interview in itself.
Well, maybe we'll weave it in here.
Yeah, so it's a long process. The creation.
Well, I got 14.7 billion years. 13.7.
Creation is a very big space, and there's kind of layers to the process. From which, well, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here,
okay.
but so this was basically starting at where the universe begins.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of started to unfold during teacher training, and there was various other kinds of experience, different kinds of things. We're talking about the mid-70s, though. It's a while back.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things for me has been interesting, though.
And you wouldn't say, I suppose, that this Hranyagarbha experience is any kind of a must-have experience in the course of one's awakening. It's just something you happen to have.
Yeah, it just happened. Yeah, something happened to have here. There's a process unfolding. It's kind of, I don't know. For me, it's sort of like I feel like I'm being trained. It's like there's this process taking place where it's
something that God wanted in your particular toolkit.
Yeah. At first, I didn't know why I knew this stuff. You know, what you know, I'm not even awake. What's all this stuff about? You know, what's this for? But of course, that was kind of meaningless. It was in a larger picture. And so over the next, well, actually, at the end of the course, see, by that point. On the courses, Maharshi would only come at the very end to make teachers.
Right.
And so, very briefly, so he had a couple of meetings with us. He was really pleased with our progress. And 3 of us got a chance to speak with him at the end, and I was lucky enough.
Privately or on the mic?
On the mic and up front, yeah. And so I talked about, you know, the breakdown of the things that had unfolded. He verified the experiences and said there'd be a lot more, which worked out to be an understatement. But anyways, but so, you know, I came back and back home to Canada and putzed around at attempting to try and teach meditation but the process continued to unfold. One of the major themes for the next couple of years was unpacking that first cognition, but also unrolling the layers. And for me, it's been interesting too, because for me, when there's been a major, like it's time to go another step deeper, one of the, I don't know if you're familiar with the term Panchadevata, the 5 forms of God.
Yeah.
So basically, one of the forms of God would show up and point out, just kind of like the little pointing for the attention, and then I would say, oh, there's that, and then the next layer would unfold.
So, like, give us an example of a form of God that would show up. I mean, what are you talking about? Krishna or something?
Well, actually, yes, on that case. I mean, they talk about the 5 in the Vedic context. They talk about 5 specific gods, but those are basically just personifications of principles, you could say, fundamental principles. Yeah. And so how they show up for any given individual will vary.
So if you're growing up in a Native American context or something and never heard of the Vedas, and you were having this kind of unfoldment, maybe some Native American personification of the same principle would show up.
Exactly, yeah. So for me, the first one was Krishna, and it was I was in this, what I now see as a nested space where with the golden egg, the universe unfolding, and
eyes closed, meditative kind of condition, right? Yeah.
No, I can think about it any time.
Oh, okay.
It's always there, and it's kind of like a part of the experience. It's like I can. I don't know. Anyways, but anyways, Krishna shows up, and there was kind of, for me, there was kind of an odd dynamic at first, because there was kind of. There's sort of thing about the personal God, and I had this concept about the personal God, and here's this form of God showing up, and is this supposed to be a personal God? What is this? But of course, there was no kind of sense of devotion or anything there, and actually, I was kind of like, what's this?
Well, just to probe a little bit, when you say Krishna showed up, were you seeing the guy with the the flute and the earrings and the whole
I call them a dancer.
Motilal Banarsidass poster?
Well, kind of like that. Yeah, I mean, there's little variations in the personalization.
And it's 3D, and he's kind of like as real as you and I.
Oh yeah. And he's dancing and
interacting
the
with
flute
you in
thing,
some way.
And there isn't really a conversation going on. There's kind of like but it's kind of making himself obvious.
Yeah.
And but for me, there was a little part I skipped over in there. I started becoming aware of what people would call astral stuff, subtle entities after teacher training when I came back to Canada. And at first, it was kind of entertaining, but I realized pretty quickly that they were basically looking for attention. Like if I asked questions, and they were always happy to give me answers, but pretty quickly it became apparent they were just basically telling me stuff to keep my attention. They didn't really have any knowledge to offer or whatever. And I realized it was kind of a mistake. So I put that aside and gave it no attention. And so
are they like lost souls or humans who have sort of gotten into some limbo state, or what are they?
Well, this is a little solid than that, but not much. It's kind of varied. There are people between lifetimes, and it depends on where they are, in their process as to whether they're able to take a supporting role or whether they're kind of just
being pests.
Yeah, kind of rabble is one of the terms I use sometimes. Where they're just kind of like looking for something to do or whatever.
Well, there's people like that who are actually people too.
Yeah, exactly, and they're just So having this being show up, I was kind of like, what's this? Another weird thing, and.
I see. So you were thinking maybe initially Krishna was another one of these.
Yeah, somebody making up some appearances, because on those other levels, they're basically made of mind stuff, right? So they can appear however. That's the part of the personalization thing I was talking about. They can appear however they wish to, and they're also your own expectations will tend to influence that. Angels are a good example. I mean, you see depictions of angels; they're almost always kind of like flowing robes and these big wings and stuff like that. But if you think about it, why would a subtle being need wings?
Yeah, right.
Physical wings or whatever. And,
is there any air there they need to?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of, but it's nothing wrong with experiencing it that way. It's just it's useful to be aware that dynamic is going on, so you're not confused by the appearance. It's what's behind that that's more important. The feeling value, that's where you want to look, because it's the feeling value that'll tell you whether something is divine or less.
Right. Yeah.
not worth your attention. So how they feel. And so it was kind of like, with Krishna, it was kind of like this, what is this? And, but a short time I kind of, okay, what's this? Find out what this is about. And he kind of made these gestures. And then I noticed there was a feature in the sky, so to speak. Sky is kind of a funny word for it, but there was this feature I hadn't noticed before. And when I put my attention on that, it kind of, the consciousness went through that into this next level. And so I stepped out of the universe space into the larger creation space, which holds, there's many universes. And by that I don't mean parallel or other dimension universes. They're quite distinct universes.
All more or less in the same dimension, just like bubbles in ginger ale.
Well, dimension is the wrong word. Dimension is a direction in space.
Yeah.
It's not, people use that word really poorly a lot. But yeah, in that it's more that space is nested. So there's infinities within infinities, and you can kind of step back through them.
So it's not like you're saying that in the vastness of all existence or all space, there's a universe here and a universe here and a universe here, like separate little, just the way galaxies are like that.
Well, it's like that. Each universe has its own space. But that space is within a still larger space.
A larger space.
But it's not really a space in the sense that we would say space. It's a space in consciousness.
So just the way in the sense that galaxies each have their own space and altogether they're within a larger space. Yes?
Kind of, except it's a distinct space.
Distinct space, okay.
Yeah, if you're within the universe space, you're not in the, well, you're still nested, but it's a distinct space. You wouldn't necessarily be aware that there was something more.
You wouldn't see the other universe over there someplace. No,
exactly. Yeah, right. It's not in the same space. It has its own space.
All right. And this is a whole topic of discussion.
Yeah. I can go on. Any of these things could go on for hours, but I'm just trying to put the thing in some context here.
Right.
So that kind of unfolded in several layers over time, and the same thing kind of happened where another form of God showed up and pointed to look a certain way, and then there was kind of like just the attention, and it kind of like what was behind that would become apparent, and so over the next couple of years I kind of worked up to the top part of creation. And
what does that mean?
Well, to the mind of God, I guess, basically divine, the origins of creation itself, this creation. And then it kind of stalled out there. Well, actually, at a certain point, I became aware that there was other creations as well that are very, very different from ours. That's actually a point to make too. The other universes are also distinct. They have their own laws of nature.
Different than ours?
Yeah.
So they might not have gravity, they might have something else? Or?
Well, no, it's not that different, but there's sort of similar principles that are functioning, but the combinations are slightly different so that the expression is different.
So for the skeptics in the audience, how do we know that you just don't have a vivid imagination, you're dreaming up all this stuff? I mean,
well, I couldn't imagine half of it, I can tell you, but it's
and when you say you got to the top of creation and knew the mind of God, knowing
the mind of God came a little bit after that, but
what was the actual? I can sense Woody Allen would come in with something real clever here about the mind of God, but what is the experience of knowing the mind of God?
Well, that's further along, but
okay, let me get to
yeah, but it's just being aware that, well, it's kind of like the way I would describe it is our creation is like a thought in the mind of God, and another creation is another thought, like that.
Yeah,
that's kind of how
you kind of see that in the Hare Krishna posters. Krishna's lying there or something, and these thought bubbles are coming out, and each one's a creation. Yeah.
Well, and sometimes though, what they're expressing is each one's a universe, which is within our creation. But in other ones, it's like a distinct creation, and they're very, very different. They don't have mechanics like ours at all. Some of them are very, very simple, whereas ours is extremely complex. But it's interesting. The simple ones are interesting because it gives you the way to experience what time is, for example, because it's like an embodiment of time. That's the whole thing. Is experiencing this time, just pure time. It's hard to describe, but anyway, I'm going into a whole other story. But anyways, but it makes a lot of things much clearer. So. Kind of things went along, and I'm just trying to think of anything else that's of any significance along in there. But eventually, I became more involved in normal living, and got a job and got married and had a couple of children, boys. They're now young adults. I'm very proud of.
And all this stuff was kind of going on in the background while you're doing all that?
Yeah. It's kind of just developing along, not as dramatically, or not as major changes, but just kind of progressing along. And then I ended up in this situation where I was working for the police, basically. I find myself working for the police. I'm a kind of inner-directed, philosophical kind of guy. Police department is not where I expected to find myself.
Were you a cop, or were you doing some computer work or something?
It was kind of a combination. I was a sworn officer, but developing evidence control systems and managing the evidence, and quartermaster issuing the sidearms and uniforms and all that stuff, various kinds of roles like that. But it was just like, kind of fish out of water kind of experience. So there was this question, in my mind, what's going on here? And what happened over time is that I started to have these brief little flashes, sort of experiences, things that would come up, sort of like memories, but weren't familiar. And then over time, they kind of opened up, and I started to become aware that I was remembering prior lifetimes. And now, one of the things that it was interesting, like the easiest way to remember an older memory like that is the strong memories, which basically usually means challenging in some way, difficult memories. And so that can be the doorway in. It's not an easy process because you have to be comfortable enough to be willing to see that, whatever, and then.
So, for instance, if you had been in Auschwitz or something, you have a strong memory, and you have to be comfortable enough to be able to relive that to some extent.
Yeah, and and sort of, I guess, have the platform to be willing to know how to purify that too.
Right.
Have the tools to be able to clear that.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're just basically bringing that old trauma back into your life now.
Re-traumatizing yourself.
Yeah. So you don't really want to go there. But anyways, for me, it was over a period of time, a couple of years, it gradually unfolded, and it became clear that the circumstances why I was working for the police, and indeed why this, marriage and so on like that, a lot of details about my life were a direct spin-off of my previous one.
Which had been?
Well, in that case, I was born into a military family in India, and an arranged marriage. But the woman that I was supposed to marry was in love with somebody else. And I had already had a prior lifetime in an ashram, and the military was not comfortable. And so I made the decision to withdraw into an ashram again and not pursue the family dharma or whatever, or marry this woman, and so she could marry this other guy instead. And that experience, that decision was very, very difficult for me, and it left this residual. And so what happened in this lifetime was that I unfolded the other decision. I did marry her. I did have that in the paramilitary career.
While, so.
Yeah. And then when that was resolved, then that whole thing wound down, and it was on to another chapter. So that was kind of a little chapter in there, and that's kind of gradually unfolded over time, more and more in different ways. I don't put a lot of attention on it. It's the past, but in the context, it puts the life in a larger context. So it's interesting from that point of view. So not a big thing to emphasize or anything, but it was it's context. Oh, and just there is that question again about imagination and and all that. But what for me happened at a certain point, just gradually over time, there'd be little details that would come up. Like 3 lifetimes ago, I wrote a book, and I looked it up, and there's a real book.
You should claim royalties.
Yeah. I don't think it's selling anymore. It's an old rare book thing now.
What was it about?
Philosophy.
Cool. As an Indian or a Westerner?
No, Westerner, British, and I spent a lot of time going back and forth to Paris and studying with the philosophers there too.
In that lifetime?
Yeah, in that lifetime, yeah.
Interesting. Anybody we would have heard of?
I don't remember enough I haven't explored it enough. That was just kind of the general context of it, and I learned a few things from that too. So it's interesting. Yeah. But it's not something I think about much now. It's interesting actually now. There's sort of like over time there's been this whole series of different ways of experiencing time. So it's kind of
so you weren't like seeking out memories of past lives or anything. These were just kind of coming to you.
Yeah, but there was that element of me trying to understand my
curiosity,
current life. Like what's going on with this current life? Why am I in this situation? Yeah, and that kind of helped me be willing to look and to encourage that to come out. So I mean, it's certainly not a necessary thing on the path. Some people never, go into that. Some people are very awake, never bother going there. It's the past who needs it. But
the lesser developed
but if you have more rich karma, then sometimes it can be interesting to explore. So gradually, more and more my life was more householder focused, and supporting the family and home renovations and all that, the usual kinds of busyness with a young family. And I went through a career change, and that's when I shifted more into technology. And so fast forward a bunch of years, and then my marriage broke up, and at the time, and I left my old a business I had helped found, and so a bunch of outer things shifted. And I started reconnecting with some old friends, and ended up just like people would just show. I went to this whole spiritual thing became more lively again. And so the cycle came around again, and reconnected with some old friends, and went to a few satsangs and met some other re-met other ones, and so on. And then kind of along in that process, I started hearing about Lauren and Lucia. And they were just teaching locally in Alberta at that time, in the Canadian prairies. And then at a certain point in 2007, they started making their satsangs available by Skype. And so I started listening, and then we started doing this Skype daisy chain thing to connect people all over the place. It was really fragile, flaky, it would crash, and we'd have to reconnect everybody all the time, and it would be noisy, and half the time you couldn't hear him, but as he said, it didn't matter. And but after a couple of calls there was just sitting listening, like I talked about at the very beginning, about just listening from silence, and he used the word surrender for the first time that I noticed, and I just heard the word differently. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but just kind of like something clicked, something let go, and it's kind of like I fell down this transparent tube or funnel and
rabbit hole.
Yeah, and something very distinctively clicked, shifted, popped, whatever you want to call it.
This is just over Skype.
Yeah, just sitting listening, and. So I wasn't sure what this was, but it was interesting because for a couple of days I couldn't figure out how to meditate, because the person that meditated was not there anymore. It's like where is this person? And it's like sense of it way off, like miles away. It was just like really weird. And it's like how do I meditate?
From a distance, the house is seen reverberating. That line?
So, but it kind of integrated better after a short time, and then I was able to kind of exist with the person better, and I guess this was on a Wednesday night, and the Friday morning I woke up and I just knew it was just clear what this was, and
What was it?
well, that I'd shifted, that there had been that shift from, so the consciousness that had been awake there as the witness all these decades, woke up to itself, and that's the key change. It's not just it waking up, but it has to wake up to itself in there, and then consciousness is awake to itself through this apparent form. So so the shift finally took place, and then things moved quickly again through that cycle. I went on my first retreat with Lauren Lucia that summer, and Lauren verified it and everything, and yeah, it was just really a rich period, a lot of bliss. And what's interesting too about the bliss is it's not like, your idea that it's like, okay, it's going to be, you're going to be kind of happy at some point in there or whatever. But when the bliss kicks in, it's like, it can come on really strong sometimes. Sometimes it kind of like just opens, and sometimes it's just like bam. Yeah. But it's not once. It's like there's layers of it. It gets bigger. There's a section in the Upanishads where it talks about 100 times the bliss of whatever is this, and then 100 times the bliss of that. And it's kind of like you step up through that over time. And it's like this blasting bliss. Tom Trainer talked about an example. Actually, it is funny too, because a couple of people have commented to me that you better hope it doesn't happen in public, because you're just kind of rendered this, bawling and laughing out loud because the happiness is just so intense. And yeah, one of them for me was, I was driving down the road in my truck, and all of a sudden just blam, and I was bawling and laughing out loud, and the sun comes out, blaring down on the truck, blaring, or whatever, that's not the right word, but just shining down on my truck, yeah. And I have the radio going, and Green Day, I'm so effing happy I could cry. It was on the radio. It was like, whoa. Yeah, but fortunately my body just kind of continued to drive the truck properly. Nothing happened. But yeah, it's pretty. So it's kind of like there's this graded process of the bliss kicking up in there.
Why do you feel that happens after a shift like that?
Well, it's not the shift itself. There's kind of, yeah. For me, one of the things I talk about is this distinction between the process of Atman and consciousness and the process of Sattva, the purity or clarity. They're kind of like these two parallel processes, the Shiva and the Shakti side, the male and female parts of the equation, and it's together that you get the fullness. Non-dual circles tend to really emphasize the Shiva side, the consciousness side, and things, some of the energy healers and ascension teachings and stuff emphasize the Sattva side, but it's really what you want is both together, and the bliss we have. What they call in the Vedas koshas, basically means sheaths. Yeah. So our bodies are composed of a series of layers, and we have our physical, the food body, literally, and then the prana body, the energy body behind that, and then the mental body behind that, and then the intellect body, which is where we also experience fine feelings and intuition and such like that, and then behind that is the bliss body. And so it's basically there all the time. It's just that the noise and unsettledness and fog and whatever in the mind and emotions is kind of like a clouds. Yeah. It's fog, dust. Maharishi used the example of the elephant stirring up the dust.
Russian dolls is a good metaphor for this, with a doll within the doll within the doll.
Yeah. Except it's the physical body is the little one in the middle.
Interesting.
Yeah. So basically, once there's enough clarity, then the bliss will come online, and it'll, like I mentioned, as there's more and more clarity, it steps up. So it's
and when you're experiencing surges of it, like you described, probably it just means that certain channels are clearing, and each time a channel of some sort clears, then there's a new surge.
Well, a new opening of it. Yeah, I'm not sure I would make it quite that simplistic, because it's. But when another layer of fog is clear, then it can come up another level.
And there might be some physiological correlate to that.
Yeah, and the other part of it that's really interesting is how quickly we get used to it.
Yeah.
It's like this blasting thing, and in a couple of hours it's normal.
Yeah.
So this whole new level of happiness, and it's normal. But it can still take time to integrate. I remember one time in the next year after that, they sent me home from work because I was sick. And
not because you were laughing uncontrollably.
No, because I was quite physically sick, and I didn't realize it.
Uh-huh.
And I was kind of like, I got home and I'm sitting down, and I was like, am I sick? And it's like, I realized, you know, my nose is pouring, and it's like, nasty earache and the whole thing. I hadn't even really noticed. It was just kind of like this background.
Because you're feeling so darn blissful.
Yeah. So, of course, things integrated better after that. It took a little time, but, you know, it was a little more integrated. So, yeah, I can pay attention to what the body's doing, and yeah, if it needs some attention,
yeah.
So about...
They say Ramana Maharshi, you know, when he had cancer and he was, you know, screaming in pain, and people say, oh, Ramana, we're so sorry you're suffering like that. And he was like, are you kidding? I'm not suffering. I'm in this blissful state. This is, you're not seeing, you know, but a bit of what my reality is here.
Yeah, that's just the surface part of it.
Yeah.
And that's a useful point, too. Just because suffering ends, doesn't mean the pain ends.
Right.
And doesn't mean that emotions end. I mean, I certainly find emotions now far bigger and richer than they used to be. Much fuller, the whole spectrum.
Less constricted.
Yeah.
They have a larger context in which to play.
Yeah, and for the most part, they come up, are experienced. Yeah, we're south of the airport.
They're not bombing us, though. So.
Yeah. So they come up, they're experienced, and then they subside, they resolve.
Yeah.
There's no resistance to the experience, normally. Not perfect or anything, but but that kind of leads me into the sort of second. So about 2 months after the shift, then the GC phase, the God consciousness, and that's part of actually the sattva side of the equation.
Interesting. It's just to interject. So you know, you went through all this stuff that you've described, and there were these cognitions of Krishna and the mind of God and all that stuff, and that was all prior to actual self-realization, which is sometimes referred to as cosmic consciousness, which is just basically the full awakening of consciousness to itself in the context of living a life, you know, waking, dreaming, sleeping. And so all that was leading up to that cosmic consciousness stage, which is actually quite intermediary in the scheme of things, as you're going to continue to describe.
Yeah, it's a key shift, though. It's a very key shift. It's the foundation of everything that happens afterwards, and it's something that's felt throughout creation. It's like it's this key. Yeah, it's a very key shift. Self-realization. It's very important.
Fundamental, foundational.
Yes, a fundamental. But yes, it's chicken feed. It's like every time you have a major shift, it's like everything before was kindergarten. Well, you're back in kindergarten, and everything before was pre-kindergarten.
Right.
It's like it's a complete. You kind of start over in certain ways.
Daycare.
Yeah. So God consciousness is in the TM context is taught as there's the cosmic consciousness and God consciousness, then unity. But if there isn't a lot of the sattva development, the GC can be very...
sattva meaning purity.
Purity, yeah. There can be very little... Yeah. There can be very little awareness of that. And in fact, some traditions even poo-poo it and talk about it as delusional or a mistake. But if there's self-realization is there, then it's actually you have the platform where that can unfold. And you know what I described before is sometimes thought of as subtle perception and GC types, but in this context it was experiences. It wasn't the value of the consciousness itself, of the state itself, because with God consciousness, what happens? There's this process I talked about before about the Kundalini rising to the crown and awakening. Then there's a descent. Shakti has risen, joined Shiva, then the two descend together. And when they get to the heart is the GC phase. And if there is enough clarity, then there's this incredible blossoming at the heart. There's just like love just blasting out. And that, it was kind of funny, at the time I was single and there was no object. I'm not particularly devotional, so there wasn't. I don't have like Ishtadevata, yeah, and there wasn't a, I don't have
a partner.
My guru relationship wasn't devotional like that.
Yeah.
So
how did
but for me it was what they call the Upaguru, which is basically the mate. That's the sort of form that's more comfortable to me, but there wasn't a mate, and so essentially one of my friends, who I highly respected, became kind of an object for a short while.
Man, woman?
Woman, yeah. As an object for the love to flow through.
So did you have an actual relationship with her, or is it more like just an idolization or a deep appreciation?
Yeah, deep appreciation. Yeah. And so we went through this kind of curious thing as
what did she make
friends.
of it?
I don't know. I won't speak for her, but
okay.
but it was.
So you're saying it wasn't even romantic; it was more like just this pure devotional kind of thing.
Yeah, just I needed a vehicle for the love to go through.
Yeah,
just like kind of everywhere, and I needed somewhere for it to go. And so that you know, it just happened to be we were spending some time together, because what we were finding, there's a thing I call resonance. It's essentially darshan, but there are individuals that you resonate with more,
right? Sure.
And than others. And as the awakening gets higher and higher, then more and more people will resonate with you. But you know, with the basic awakening, there's a slightly smaller range. Anyways, we were quite resonant, so spending time together was like amplifying the silence just by having tea together or whatever. And so we were spending a little extra time together right at that point, and it just happened to be that it. Yeah, so it was an interesting episode. So there was this huge flowing of love and a much deeper sense, because before that there was perception of the divine, but not the divine, the real divine, the love and the oomph.
So you mentioned you termed it God consciousness. It's best not to rub the wire because it picks the sound up.
Right, sorry.
You termed it God consciousness. So I guess the question, to paraphrase Tina Turner, was what's God got to do with it? You know, I mean, because you had you found a friend, a human friend that you were channeling your devotion to.
Right, but that was
why would we attach the word God to this state?
Well, that's the expression, because it's what I'm expressing is the divine. It's not that she was. Well, she was kind of my God, or whatever, in a sense, in a broad kind of sense, goddess, yeah, in a sense of that process. But
would it be fair to say that you were appreciating? But it was her as an expression of God, so you were feeling devotion to God in the form of this woman.
Yeah, like namaste. But it's also, that love that's bursting forth is the flow of the divine itself. It's that expression of the divine, and so it. Yeah, so it has that flavor of, you know, what you might not like the God word, whatever, like that.
I love the God word. I'm just trying to understand how you're using it.
Yeah, but it's just that when it's actual expression. Like before, I mentioned, you know, I met Krishna, and he's doing his thing. But it was kind of like, you know, who is this guy? You know, what's this about? You know, kind of like not a God, you know, devotional relationship going on there. So it was a very different thing. So recognition that there was the divine, but it was on the level of experience, not on the level of a much deeper value of the divine. You know, understanding how the divine moves and flows through everything and so on. So a much deeper value of what had been there before unfolded. And then there was another shift happened about 2 months after that. It kind of came in stages. It was kind of interesting coincidence. A friend of mine was watching a DVD of Adyashanti and Locke Kelly talking called "Journey After Awakening," and it's basically on this phase between initial awakening and unity. And they said, you know, they're describing your experience. You should come over here. And so I watch it, and there's this one other thing to happen. They call it the barbecue.
Locke called it that?
Locke called it that, and in the discussion. And basically, what happens is the descent reaches the gut. And a very, very long time ago, when in the cycles of time, consciousness, how this get into this big whole description here. Basically, consciousness goes through these rising and falling cycles of through time. So there's higher consciousness. People are more.
You mean like yugas or something?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's higher consciousness. So people are more awake, happier times, and then we go into darker times, and then we cycle back up again.
Right.
It's just like the seasons, you know. And during the last descent, there was a place where there was a somewhat precipitous drop, and people lost their connection with the divine fairly suddenly, and so it created this kind of like grip, like grasping, and what we grasped at was the individuality, what was still there, the sense that I am here. And so it's kind of this core grip in the gut that is the core identity. Adyashanti actually talks about this too, head, heart, gut, he describes in some of his material. So that's not conscious until that point usually, and so it became conscious, it released quite quickly, fortunately, but it was interesting for me. I might not have even noticed it, except for the fact that I knew about the barbecue step, because it was just kind of like this anomalous experience where there's this really strong, not exactly fear, but like a kind of thing right out of nowhere, and processed away, and then what I realized was there was no longer a David there anymore, and. For a couple of weeks in there, I took to dropping personal pronouns altogether.
And I referred very annoying to talk with.
Yeah, exactly. One of those annoying phases. Yeah, and so I referred to the body mind as the unit. You know, it's kind of like, it was kind of an odd stage, but it was fairly short. And then I went on another retreat with Laura and Lucia, and then one evening. I was lying in bed. You know, it was dark in the room, very bit of light leaking in. You know, I could still see there was a room there, but at that point I realized it was all gone.
What was all gone? All the Davidness?
Well, not just the Davidness, but everything. All that history of cognitions and experiences and the awakening and all that stuff was gone, just emptied out. And so I'm kind of looking around this very, this dark room. It's like the room's still here, like all creation, the whole thing is gone, right? But it's like the room's still here. What's with this? And so basically, what happened was all the previous stuff collapsed. The shift took place, and then I was able to bring it back again into that new context. So there's kind of like those three stages of self-realization, unity, and Brahman. We'll get to in a bit. And then there's the progression of refinement, the sattva, the clarity taking place with the heart and the refinement and so on. Parallel to that, and whereas this first stage, as I mentioned, they begin with a realization. There's a shift in being, and then everything kind of develops from that. With the other ones, it's a progression to a climax. And every time we have a shift in our stage of consciousness, it puts all that refinement, the sattva stuff, in a new context. And so before there was God consciousness. Now that there's what takes place after that is bringing that stuff back into unity, and so you get refined unity. So at first, though, there's just this shift, and there was no longer a division between inside and outside. It was just like a continuum. And I contained everything. I was the container of the world, and the world is no longer separate. Now this changes the witness dynamic, though. It's no longer that you're a detached witness, because the world is you also. And so the observing is still taking place, but it's no longer separate from the contents. It's kind of essentially the observer and observed collapse together, leaving only observing the process of experience, the Devata value, the divine value. So that kind of process took place, and unity is kind of different too, in that it has a series of stages, because you're basically unifying through experiencing. What you experience, you become, and so you go through this process of experiencing, bringing back the old refined perception stuff in this new context, and just old memories, and what's out here, and all this stuff. And as it's experienced, it's integrated into this one wholeness progressively, and it goes progressively deeper over time. And this is quite, and this isn't like a concept of oneness or a feeling of oneness or anything like that. This is on the level in consciousness itself. So, for example, if I on the level of senses, if I touch you, I feel you with my hand, but I also am you experiencing being touched simultaneously. They're both happening
But
at the
you
same
don't feel
time.
the sensation on my shoulder the way I feel the sensation on my
Yes.
shoulder. You do? Feel
Yes.
it?
Yeah.
So-
not now, but at the time.
When you touched me.
But no, but I mean, when I was in that stage.
I see. When
I was in that stage.
Yeah. You're no longer
Yeah.
in that stage.
Yeah, and now I don't pay attention to that stuff
Right.
because it's too much information.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, it's like, because it's happening on the level of consciousness, it's inclusive of everything, and so it's inclusive of all your levels of experience. And you put your attention on a tree or a dog, and you experience what that being is experiencing. But you experiencing it from where you are, not from where they are. That's because it's your consciousness that's doing the experiencing. So this isn't astral traveling or empath stuff.
So if
either.
they're
Again, it's
suffering, do you
taking place
experience suffering?
yes, but it's not your suffering you're experiencing in the sense of, well,
Like you wouldn't want to get a job at Red Lobster throwing lobsters into the boiling water or something, because you'd be experiencing what the lobsters are experiencing.
yeah, but that's empathic stuff. But that's if you're engaging that, because there is always the choice. Like with the refined perception, you can look at the tree, or you can look at the tree and see the energy flowing and the dynamics going on with the tree, or in unity experience what it is to be a tree. That's how you're using your attention.
Yeah.
But if you're being a householder living in the world doing things, there's a tree. It's fine. You don't need to look at every single tree and see what it's doing.
Right. Too much information.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you still have a life to live here in your physical body and in your physical life
Yeah.
and responsibilities and all that. But anyways,
But not having all those cognitions of every tree and so on doesn't deprive you of the essential value that has somehow dawned in your
Right.
experience.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So and you can filter the information too, so you can experience that they are suffering, but not experience their suffering. Or not make it your suffering, because it's a difference. Because there's that distinction too, again, between suffering and pain. I mean, you cut yourself, there's pain, but how you respond to that makes a difference of whether there's suffering with it.
Right.
Like when you make a drama about, oh, this never should happen. I shouldn't have done that. That was really stupid of me.
Yeah.
Get into a big drama about it, or you just experience the pain itself.
Yeah.
And one of the things interesting about pain, and that's physical and emotional pain, not both, is that when you acknowledge it, it will back way off. It's when you resist pain that it's trying to get the signal to you that something's wrong. And
One
if you
thing I
resist
wonder
it,
about
it's
when I
something
hear
wrong.
that is that it sort of seems like it depends upon the degree of pain. Like, to be crucified, for instance, and not regard it and not suffer during the process would, it seems to me, require a very profoundly established
Yes.
state of enlightenment.
Yes.
Certainly the pain's going to be there, but whereas to stub your toe and would not suffer would require a much lesser degree of enlightenment.
Yeah. Well, or attachment, really. And that's actually the important distinction in there, because that's more related to the sattva side again. Because people can wake up and still be very attached to certain kinds of things. Now, there is this kind of process, I kind of jokingly refer to it as the three amigos there before, amigos. Because there's like with awakening, there's the loss of the concept of a me, an end of the sense of a me that's an individual separate from other things like that. And then with the heart, there's a loss of the emotional drivers of that. So after the GC phase, actually it gets much easier to wind down some of the old concepts and mind things and stuff like that. And then with unity, it's a loss of that core I sense, which is the origin of that in the first place. So once the unity is established, then that's very clear. So someone who's somewhere in the middle there is quite likely going to still be having some dynamics about, they blew the middle out, but there's still old habits of being a certain way about stuff, resisting certain kinds of experiences or whatever. There's still some of that old dynamic is still there, able to kind of revive bits and pieces until that kind of settles out. Unpacking, sometimes it's called, or whatever. So the shift itself is key, but there's a process that happens after that where it has to be unloaded. Adyashanti talks about having a honeymoon after the shift, and then followed by the mind trying to come back and reassert itself as being quite common. And the thing about the West too is we have a real mind-dominated culture, so that's more likely to happen. There tends to be a little less of that clarity side of the equation, the heart side, more mind, less heart kind of thing in the West. There's certainly all kinds of variations in that, but yeah, it's more of it's more prominent in the West, some of that stuff.
Okay.
So yeah, unity process unfolded over a number of years. I'm losing track of all the details of it now, but a gradual, progressive, bigger and bigger kind of completeness until it reached a point where a consciousness became aware of itself at a really global level. So there's consciousness aware of itself, Atman, self-aware Atman, aware of itself both globally and at every point within itself. And essentially, you and I are different points within itself, points of observation within that one wholeness, non-separate, like little waves on the ocean. I have a little graphic of that on my blog. In this global awareness. And once consciousness reached that point where it knows itself fully, there's an interesting thing that can take place. It has always been consciousness aware of itself. But when it knows itself fully, it can stop looking in and look beyond itself. Which is kind of interesting, because when you talk to somebody who's, even in unity, it's kind of like, what are you talking about? Because consciousness is infinite, it's eternal, it's existence is.
So how can anything be beyond it?
Yeah, how can anything be beyond it? How can there be an origin or something?
Beyond it implies there's something outside of it.
Yeah, and what happens is it turns and it sees the origins of itself.
Consciousness has origins?
Yeah, so consciousness has a beginning in Brahman. In a sense, it's kind of the dynamics get quite different then, but. And that leads
not in some timeline sort of sense.
Yeah, no,
way back then. But
this is beyond time.
Primordial now.
Yeah. So essentially, there's these two qualities you could almost say that there's this alertness and this liveliness. And the liveliness stirs alertness, and it becomes conscious.
Yeah.
And then the liveliness stirs consciousness to flow, and it flows and curves back on itself, and then becomes self-aware. And when it becomes self-aware, it becomes aware of its own existence. And existence becomes consciousness.
Existence becomes conscious intelligence. Intelligence assumes the role of creative intelligence.
Yeah. So that's the dynamic in consciousness, but there's that piece before it, and that kind of. So there's that dynamic. The consciousness becomes aware; it has its origins, and then it depends. There's the kind of two things that happen in there. This is when that's the other side of the equation with sattva side. It reaches a point where you have this choice of uniting with God, sort of the ultimate stage of unity is uniting with the divine, or to retain that lesha vidya, remains of ignorance, to keep a slight distance, so that you can still be devoted to God.
Right.
Yeah. And so there's that choice that takes place where you can unite or whatever. Most people I know have done the uniting thing, that have made this step. And so you become one with God. You then go beyond. As a result of that, you step beyond Atman, you transcend Atman into Brahman. And they call that the Great Awakening in the Vedic literature. It's a very big change. Again, the entire enlightenment that had been there before, gone. From the examples I know, it looks like there's typically a two-stage process. Firstly, there's this, unless it's extremely clear. Firstly, there's this stepping out of there's the stepping out of unity into Brahman. So what you're conscious of is what you're leaving behind, what you lose, basically. And that can be challenging for some people. It can certainly be a surprise, unexpected, in the way because it's complete, it's thorough. All that, layers of unity and all that intimacy and the relationship with the divine and all that stuff, gone.
Now, you've thrown the word Brahman here a few times. I think you've kind of defined it, but you better define it a little bit more, because people aren't going to necessarily be...
Okay, well, if you're familiar with some of those things, like the Mahavakyas from the Upanishads, I am that, thou art that, all this is that, that alone is. I mean, that's more a reference to the unity process, but essentially that is Brahman. And defining Brahman is an interesting one, because it's not consciousness, but it's not non-consciousness. It's not existence, it's not non-existence, because those are actually dualities. And it's not obvious, even in unity, that the fact that you exist and you're conscious is a duality, but it actually is a very subtle duality. And Brahman is beyond that too. They call it, and the Brahma Sutra calls it the aggregate. It's like this coming together into this totality, to this wholeness that's greater than all of it. And it's interesting, because then the whole perspective, up until then there's been this whole perspective of this unfolding divine and the structure of creation and all that going on, and now it's gone, there's nothing. And not a nothing in terms of emptiness, but a nothing in terms of nada. That never happened. Creation never happened,
right.
Never will happen, that kind of stuff. So it's like, and here I had been this guy, championing that your understanding of this, the creation is an illusion, or the world is Maya, an illusion, or something like that, is not a complete understanding. And actually, that's interesting. That's a worthwhile point to make. This from Shankara. Maya does not actually mean illusion. It comes from the root to build. It's a reference to creation. And when, as Shankara points out, when tamas guna, the inertia, is dominant in the physiology and our experience, we experience the world as real, solid. When that is transformed through rajas, or fire transformation, we come to see Maya as illusory. The world is illusion. And then when sattva becomes dominant, the transformation starts to complete, then we see lila, the divine play. The world becomes seen as a play of the divine. And so, in other words, the world as illusion is a stage of sattva development. It's not a marker for stage of consciousness.
The stage towards sattva development.
Yeah, and so some people will go into self-realization with lots of sattva already, so they won't have a world as illusion stage. Yeah. Because they did that already beforehand, or whatever. However, that showed up for them. So it's part of that sattva process. And then, but even, there's at the bottom of my website is a little saying from the Isha Upanishad. The face of truth is hidden by a covering of gold. And of course, from the Krishna to Arjuna in the Gita, be without the three gunas. So even sattva itself, you want to go beyond, but that becomes the platform for a lot of development.
So sattva is the covering of gold, sattva or purity. Yeah. Which itself has an obscuring value to some extent, although nothing much by comparison with tamas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's So it's still, but it's still a quality of expression. It's not the source itself. So for me, so there's that first stage into Brahman, where you're more aware of what you've lost, and then there's this second stage where you start to become aware of what Brahman itself is. But it's like, the Tao that can be described as not the Tao kind of thing. It's a really challenging to describe in any way, because you can sort of like, well, it's not consciousness, but it's not consciousness. It's not, you can do all these things where it's not this, it's not that, and you get those phrases. What is the one that another one? Shankara said that how was that? Brahman.
The world is an illusion. Brahman alone is real, the world is Brahman.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
thing.
exactly. Because those are all three true simultaneously.
Right.
And it's this complete merger of paradoxes into true non-duality. Because a lot of people talk about self-realization as being non-duality, and they use those kind of terms. But if there's a separate illusory world, that's not, even if the world's an illusion, that's duality.
Right.
That's Dvaita.
You got some non-duality over here, but there's all this other stuff. That's
Exactly.
separate
So
from
that's
it.
not non-duality.
Right.
Non-duality unfolds with unity.
Right.
That comes a little later. So yeah. Anyway, so it's this process. So the second stage is when you become aware of what actually is here, and it really depends on the person. For me, the process is quite a bit slower. I think probably because I had that long witnessing, those earlier stages came quite quickly, and then the process has gradually started to slow down because I've used up my how to word that. My credits, whatever. I don't know. but it's just, anyways. There's more. It's a much. It's kind of like, it's funny. I can say abstract, but it's sort of like there's this stage in unity where the world becomes more real than it ever was before. Because it is the self,
yeah.
And then the self is eternal. It's like the world takes on this concreteness and solidity because it's absolute.
Yeah.
It has an appearance, a surface appearance, which is changing, but behind that is, or then there's the subtler value where we're seeing the flow, and behind everything the flow of consciousness that's giving rise to all this appearance. But then in the Brahman perspective, this isn't happening. It's essentially, it's like the divine had this brief thought musing, and it's like, and that's led to these gazillions, this huge vast creation with a gazillion beings in each of a whole bunch of universes, and all this massive laws of nature and this whole process and that kind of stuff. But it's just like this kind of thought. It never actually happens, or whatever.
A little brain fart.
Yeah, kind of like that. And it's kind of interesting too, because when you explore some of these, the subtle dynamics of all this, it's like, in the Yoga Vasishtha, there's that story of the crow, the Bhushunda.
Kakabhushunda or something like that.
Yeah, and he has figured out a way to live through the dissolution of the universe, or the creation or something. And he's lived through 10 cycles, and in those 10 cycles, Vasishtha, the sage Vasishtha, had come to visit him, 7 or 8 times or something, but not every time. So it's kind of like there's little slight variations, and it's repeating itself. So, before, for me, the purpose, there was that sense of Leela, the purpose of creation was for the self to know itself. But once it's complete, it's done. Why would you do it again? Even if there's slight variations, you're not going to, So, but the Brahman answers that question. It doesn't in the first place, so it didn't need to happen.
There's a couple of questions here.
Okay.
One is, there's a thought that's been kind of percolating as you've been speaking, and that is, who set this whole game up? I mean,
But they didn't.
They didn't, but let's say from the perspective that they did.
Oh, from unity, yeah.
From the perspective that there is a creation, and it has all these laws that govern it, and who set that whole thing in motion? Or can't the question be answered?
You could say that. Well, you could say the divine, God.
Why?
However you want to say.
Then the next question is why.
Well, if you look at silence with nothing in it, what's the point of? There's
boring.
But there's nothing you can learn from that, right? You can't learn about self unless you experience yourself. And so if you express all these qualities of intelligence within it, then there's that opportunity for consciousness to discover itself and all these little details. So consciousness, I mentioned earlier, how consciousness is aware of itself globally, but then it goes into at each point to become aware of a different perspective. Like you're experiencing me from a certain perspective, I'm experiencing you from a certain perspective, and there's various flavors and qualities that are distinct between the two of us. Yeah. So that's
So the whole
it's a way
creation
to-
is a way for God to know Himself as a living reality, as opposed to a flat, unmanifest,
Yeah.
nothingness.
Yeah. No, but it's not even like there's no need for God to know itself that way. But there's this quality of because God is, already knows everything. It's already all there. So there's this quality of consciousness that arises from the divine. Then the consciousness wants to know itself, and then there's a whole series of tiers to the process, and so each layer wants to unfold the next layer, and then there's this kind of going out into the creation, and then getting lost in it, and then finding your way back again.
Right.
And it's kind of that whole story that various.
And as you know, some people regard creation as meaningless, mechanistic, cold, random, accidental, all kinds of words like that.
Yeah.
You and I don't think see it that way, and nor would most of the people watching this. It seems to be pregnant with purpose of some sort, an evolutionary purpose.
Oh yeah, and there's life everywhere.
Yes.
That's been aware to me for a very long. I mean, you're never alone.
Everywhere would even mean places that would be considered entirely inhospitable to life, such as the center of the sun. I mean, that is life as much as our liver.
Right, but there's life, but it's not. There's life that exists not just in a physical sense,
no, we're not just talking biological.
but on those levels of energy and mind and that kind of stuff. Yeah. There are beings that exist and express through whatever they have available, and they're having their own process of experiencing and doing whatever their own dharma or whatever purpose that they have.
And also, wherever you look, there's intelligence in abundance. I mean, go out somewhere in intergalactic space and look at a cubic centimeter of what apparently is nothing, and there are laws of nature functioning there which evidence incredible intelligence.
Well, just to consider ourselves. I mean, we exist as these complex life forms on a planet, and you think about just the odds of that from the known physical laws. The entropy. Entropy is a very powerful force. Yeah. Why is there any? How did the planet manage to even be formed in the first place? That didn't just fall apart and disintegrate. And there we can talk about gravity and various things that happen, but then it stabilizes after. But how would life? An intelligent life form on that just from random mechanical.
I forget who it was, Teilhard de Chardin or somebody who said the universe isn't winding down, it's winding up. There's this continual emergence of orderliness out of...
It doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I mean, there is this where you're going to talk about creationism or whatever, what is the term they use for the...
intelligent design or something.
Yeah, intelligent design,
Well, there's an obvious counterbalance to entropy. I mean, otherwise everything would have just ground to dust.
Exactly.
By now.
That force of order has to be stronger than entropy for this system to continue. And actually, that's what dharma means. It's that which sustains the purpose, or the sense of. It's often translated as purpose, but in a deeper sense, dharma is that which keeps things going, so that it can unfold.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a minute ago, you said something about how. When you've gone through this whole process and come to its conclusion, why would you want to do it again?
Creation,
Creation. And that, to me, sounded like it was expressed from a somewhat individual perspective, because from the universal perspective, it would seem that it's an eternal cycle which would never sort of reach a point of never wanting to be done again. There's this kind of continual...
Yeah, what I was expressing there was my experience at the time had been that the purpose of creation is for the self to know itself and all these different, but then when it becomes apparent that it keeps cycling and it repeats itself, then the question comes up, well, why would it do that?
And?
Well, then that's resolved with Brahman when you see that it didn't do it in the first place.
Yeah, so it never did it in the first place. But from the perspective that it has done it, then it keeps doing it.
Yeah, well, it appears to keep. Appears to keep going.
And then it knows itself in the form, and in this form. This form has become a conduit or an instrument through which it can know itself, but not necessarily in this petunia, and or in that frog or whatever.
Yeah.
So it seems that all forms continue continue to evolve and serve as vehicles for the souls which embody them to progress through stage upon stage of greater and greater sophistication in the course of greater and greater self-discovery.
Yeah, there's an interesting mechanics.
Sense?
Yeah, there is an interesting mechanics to that too, because there is what's called the Veda itself. You know, that we think of Vedas as being books, but the books are actually written versions of descriptions of what might be called blueprints or core
templates, maybe even.
Yeah. Core templates, and essentially they're laws of nature that are structured in divine mind, you could say, that at a certain point, a certain being arises who cognizes that Veda, and that activates that law of nature in creation, and then that next stage can unfold. So there's kind of like this like you say template or blueprint for this, and the series, a sequence for that progression to unfold in.
So are you implying here that the Vedas are sort of the template for the manifestation of the universe, creation after creation?
Well, they're the template for creation.
Yeah.
And it's just the Veda we use is associated with this creation, but there's also Veda associated with other creations.
Each creation having its own Veda.
Well, Vedas, and they're not kind of separated per se. There's Veda, and within it is the various.
Yeah.
There's a scene in 2001.
Space Odyssey.
Where they go inside the HAL and they're
all right, pulling out the chips.
They're pulling out the chips, and they're kind of like what's it called, acrylic blocks.
Yeah.
That's what they look like to me.
Oh, the Vedas?
Acrylic, there's like these acrylic blocks that contain three-dimensional experiences, like an encoded experience kind of thing. But the experience is designed to awaken that law of nature.
Yeah, so that's an interesting comment, because for a moment there I was beginning to feel like, well, we're getting awfully speculative here and philosophical and metaphysical and, Hindu woo-woo. But what you just implied...
That's one reason I don't talk about this stuff very much.
Yeah, what you just implied is that, you actually experience this stuff.
Oh, yeah. No, it's, yeah.
So do you feel like to all appearances, you have a personal life, you have friends, you have interests, you have a job, you do this, you do that, you earn money, you pay taxes, whatever you do, and so one might ask, well, what impact has all this had on your personal life? And you might answer, I don't have a personal life, but by all appearances, you do.
Yes.
And so, and I guess I'll just riff for a second more here. And does all this have a practical significance in terms of its, in terms of the living of an apparent personal life? If you had it to do all over again, would you do it all over again?
Oh yeah.
Has it enhanced life immeasurably over what life ordinarily is, how life ordinarily is lived?
Yeah.
And questions like that.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, the practical value is more in quality of life and insight about why my life is the way this is, or why there's whatever going on. It's I don't know. There's certain aspects of it that there's periods of time where I've been kind of not offline exactly, but where something dominated so much that I was kind of like spending a lot of time just trying to work through whatever it was. I mean, I didn't spend 2 years on a park bench like Eckhart's, but there was periods of a week or a month or something like that here and there
where you weren't overly very functional because you were processing something. So
yeah. And this life has also been very. I mentioned before about chapter oriented. I have these really distinct chapters where there's kind of like this career and and relationship and that kind of stuff
yeah.
like that goes on. And then it finishes and it's on to the next chapter. And it's like, and that's been hard on relationships because the life keeps shifting.
Huh. So do you feel like somehow you process relationships much more quickly than the average person? So for what one person might take a lifetime to do, you work it through in a few months and then on to the next one?
Well, that's not my intention.
Yeah.
I have this maybe fantasy idea of having an actual relationship that lasts and you know. Well, I mean, I have certainly had relationships that have lasted, but just, you know, a long-term, like a really long-term, a lifetime
like
relationship.
the rest of your life kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that would be nice.
And so what happens when you have one of those in the works and then it doesn't work out? Do you find that all this kind of cosmic perspective and unity awareness and all still doesn't enable you to deal with the vicissitudes of human behavior?
It does give. There's a lot of insight. You know, I'm not. You know. It's easier to process through this stuff, and there isn't.
You're less reactive, less judgmental, less
and it's just like smoother, and it's like, kind of stuff. Oh God, this again. Sometimes, but it's like there's, you know, it is becoming clearer that over time that's clearing. The stuff is ending, and so the life is becoming much simpler. And there is little things come up here and there, but it's just nowhere near the drama, the complexity, the concern. So yeah, much greater quality of life in so many ways. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, you know, interesting because things keep changing, and there's this, and now it's kind of like multi-layered too, because now one of the processes we didn't get into was the way the body shifts, the body itself. There's this progression through deeper levels of understanding, because once you become aware that your body is, you know, contains the universe kind of thing, there's this kind of progression through, like one of the layers is the Devata body, where you become aware that your body contains all the Devata that manage all life forms in all universes. And so it's like your finger is this sea of these little dots of profound intelligence that are interacting and creating this finger for all beings in all universes and all time simultaneously. It's like,
yeah.
So it's kind of, you know, my imagination just couldn't come up with some of this stuff. It's just real mind stretches sometimes to digest even. It can take a while to kind of process.
Let me ask a mundane question and then come back to the finger, because this interests me. Mundane question is, if there's so much fulfillment, complete, you know, profound fulfillment, why would you want a relationship? Or is it because of the value of devotion, like you said before, where you had this devotion?
There's that, but there's also, I'm just a guy.
Yeah.
There's still a person here who has a life. I'm still this householder, going through my process and going here and doing that, and I got my work and the writing and the blah 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 that's going on.
So there's still a personal human level which enjoys companionship and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And friends and little fun.
There's that saying, the individual is cosmic, but the word individual is still there.
Yeah. So, but the individuality is kind of like this surface little point on this wholeness.
Yeah.
And so there's the Devata body is an expression of the cosmic body, which contains all of the creation in that, and you know, and it's the one that sets the form that we have, the physical forms that the various life forms
have. Do we
have.
each have a Devata body?
No, there's one Devata body for our creation, and
which
one
means
cosmic body.
Which means the collective conglomeration of Devatas? Is that what the Devata body is? Then explain Devata, because we haven't defined.
Oh yeah, Devata basically means light being. It's
impulsive intelligence.
Yeah. When it's more expressed, on a more expressed level, then you're talking about angels and you know, gods and whatever, like that kind of stuff. But on a more subtle level, it's just this profound alive intelligence.
Ocean of intelligence with impulses in it, or waves in it, or
Yeah,
currents within
Yeah, that's
it.
more on the level of the universe. This is a little subtler than that, but yeah, but that's what gives rise to that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that thing you said a minute ago about, you know, the finger and structures of fingers for all creation or something like that.
All beings and all.
And I've heard this before, that, you know, people say, well, the whole universe is contained within my body.
Yeah.
And that's not my experience, so I'd like to understand it a little bit better. So obviously everyone could say that, even though everyone may not experience that, I presume. If one person can say that, then anyone can say that. And is it just that the universe is contained within a human body, or is the universe also contained within that grape leaf?
No, well, yes, but it's because it's not the human body isn't this person. This person is just an end expression. This body is just an end result, an effect of processes within consciousness. And so this body is actually cosmic.
Yeah.
And so it contains the universe, it contains the Devata, it contains all of creation.
So you know
and
that...
it's kind of these layers coming back. There's actually a thing, one of the older articles on my site on the Mahavakyas has another thing below that where it talks about the Aham Shavir, and that where I am the universe, I am the Devata body, I am the cosmic body, I am the Veda. It kind of goes up in stages.
You know that William Blake poem where infinity in a grain of sand, eternity in an hour, and all that, you know, or something in a wildflower. So
beautifully expressed.
Are you saying that since this is ultimately composed of infinity, then how much infinity does it take to contain a universe? You know, and therefore
an infinity.
And therefore, since every point is an infinity in a grain of sand.
Yeah. But it's nested, like I mentioned early on. It's like infinities within infinities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the whole universe within the body, I mean.
But that is the same thing as the universe. It's not. It's not like there's not like the universe and there's a body inside the universe that it's the universe too. It's that the body is the universe. They're the same thing.
Help us understand better, because I don't even know how to ask questions to clarify this. But you know, you've been in various stages of ignorance during your life, so try to put yourself in those shoes and put yourself in those shoes. Imagine the average listener trying to make sense of what we're saying, and so what in the hell does it mean?
Not gonna lie, I haven't talked about this so much.
What does it mean to say the universe is within your body? Because by everything
it's just the experience. It's like you're sitting in, like I was on teacher training.
So
one of the
this
experiences I had was sitting in the golden egg.
This is the Andromeda galaxy over here, and the Crab Nebula over there.
Yeah, actually, I once talked about body stars. That there's kind of like these places on the body that correspond with various places in the galaxy, or in the universe. Yeah. But it depends on how you're looking at it. That's when you get into, like, some of the Yoga Sutras talk about the placement of the stars in relationship to each other and their movement, and that has a relationship also with the body too. So, yeah, but it's not. You can't take it in a literal sense. It's like the universe has this arm over here with this finger, because that's just the shape that this appearance has. It's more that it's. They're not. It's like they're different expressions of the same thing. So universe is an expression, this body is an expression, it's the one thing. And so one expression is this person, another expression is the universe.
Yeah.
Another expression is you.
Okay, so let's say a cup is an expression of clay, and a statue is an expression of clay. Various things are made of clay.
Right.
And so the stuff of which this is made since the stuff of which this cup is made is also the stuff of which everything is made, then in a sense everything is contained within this cup, because it's the same stuff. So is that the sense in which you're saying that the universe is within the body, because what the body is made of ultimately is consciousness, or the absolute, or whatever, and the absolute contains everything. Therefore, if we appreciate the absolute level of the body, we're seeing the body as something essentially which in its essence contains everything, and there's no sort of this much absolute and this much absolute. The absolute is absolute, And so if you're looking on the absolute level of things, then wherever you look, you see everything contained in every point.
Yeah. Yeah,
does that make sense?
And it also goes back to what I was talking about with the unity stage, where you become everything, and it's until you reach like the farthest point beyond perception, whatever that quote is part of myself, and it's the same kind of process. It's just like we are everything, and it's that essence is within everything, and so you can experience yourself as this body here, or as this universe over there, or as the ant, or as God.
So we are everything. We are that which pervades everything. And when we say we are not referring to this bag of bones or this bag of bones.
Yeah.
We're referring to the essential we.
Yeah.
And this bag of bones is just something which enables individual perception, speech, things like that.
Yeah.
But it's not the we that we're actually referring to when we say that we are everything, or we contain everything, or even the body contains everything.
Yeah, right. And it's.
I'm starting to get it.
Yeah. No, but it's pretty abstract. But I mean, one of the things is, like I mentioned a couple of times in the thing, when you're in one stage, that's the reality. Knowledge is structured in consciousness. Knowledge is different in
different states of consciousness.
Right. So the reality of self-realization is a profound shift from the reality of prior to that, but there's this other reality in unity, and there's this other reality in Brahman, and it's really useful to understand those distinctions, because when you're reading Shankara or Sufi poem or whatever like that, if you understand those distinctions, then you can get a sense of where they're speaking from.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of confusion now where people are taking Vedanta and applying that to self-realization. And self-realization is in there, but most of Vedanta is more about unity and Brahman.
Beyond self-realization.
Yeah. And so when they're talking about oneness, and they're talking about the nature of the world, and there's a huge distinction between the world as an illusion and the world never happened. I mean, you can use those as similar ways in a sentence to describe, to try and describe something, but in the sense of the reality of it, they're two completely different realities, very distinct, and in between that is this whole other reality, and neither of them seem to be compatible. But what happens with Brahman is it becomes inclusive of all of it. And then it's just a matter of, okay, if you put your attention here, then you can talk in a unity context and describe it in a certain way, whatever like that. But the fundamental reality is extremely abstract and very difficult to describe. And it's not something like even somebody in unity would have trouble, understanding Brahman. So. Yeah, it's not something, Lauren just says, don't try to figure it out. It's not something the mind can grasp. It's just,
One thing I think you're trying to do, though, and which I'm also hoping to be contributing to some degree, is to achieve greater clarity in our culture, in our larger spiritual community, as to what all these terms mean, what awakening means, what enlightenment means, what stages there may be.
Yeah.
Because are there really as many kind of like realities to the unfoldment of enlightenment as there are people, or is there sort of a roadmap which we all understand approximately and experience to some degree of clarity, but which, if we all had perfect understanding and perfect clarity, we would be unanimous in our understanding and agreement about?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm working on. I've had the pleasure, going on, particularly from going on Lauren Lucia retreats, is seeing a lot of people go through these shifts.
Yeah.
And so it's given me a lot of material to understand the variations, but also to understand the underlying process. So what's the underlying process, and then, how are there these variations? Like I found there's 5 typical ways that people will subjectively experience the initial self-realization shift. And of course there's huge variations in the intensity of purification or experiences that may or may not come with it, and all this, variations that go on. There are dominant guna at the time, whether it's sattva or rajas or tamas, and all these different things will affect the subjective experience.
Yeah.
Also the kind of techniques that they use, because that cultures a certain kind of awareness. And so there's all this variation, but there's also this underlying process that's taking place. And that's what I was talking about earlier on. There was, clarifying about there's this witness thing that can happen separately from the awakening, or it may happen together with it. Because it's not really that far from Makara to the crown, Bindu. But there's this what's the underlying process that's happening behind that, and that distinction about a self-realization, that there's self-awakening, but there's the actual awakening is when self wakes up to itself, not just that we become aware that there's a self. But I mean, we can call that an awakening, but the real awakening that we're looking for is when self wakes up to itself through this apparent form. Yeah. That's the actual self-realization shift that's so important.
So, broader question is, do you feel like it's theoretically possible to, if you tried to use the understanding of the topography of North America that was current when Lewis and Clark first went west to navigate from St. Louis to Portland now, you wouldn't get very far. You'd end up in some river pretty soon or something.
Yeah,
you'd be trying to follow the Oregon Trail, which no longer actually exists.
Yeah.
And so do you feel like it's that we could eventually, but these days, of course, with satellite mapping and GPS and all that stuff, we understand the topography of North America and the whole world very precisely, right down to the square foot, more or less. Do you feel that spiritually speaking, we could arrive at a state of understanding as a culture which would be like our modern understanding of the topography of North America as compared with our current understanding, which would be more Lewis and Clark-like in its accuracy?
Yeah, very much. And there's a couple of things about that. One is that yes, that it's perfectly easy to define it much more clearly than
so over the next couple hundred years or something we might have
evolved. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, that's one of the things. I'm working on a book I'm hoping to get published in the next little while. And that's basically what it's about, is what is that process that unfolds. Yeah. And it's interesting too, because there are some teachers who either discourage talking about stages or deny there are stages.
Well, I think they're just being simplistic. They're just thinking, okay, it's all unity. How can there be stages in unity?
Yeah. Right. There can be some of that kind of thing. But one of the problems is one of the common themes in there is concepts of a process are a barrier to the process itself. And that's true. Our concepts about it are a barrier.
Really?
But a concept,
so watching this interview might be an impediment to people?
Well, it depends on the approach they're taking to it. But a concept of no stages is the same barrier as a concept of stages, because what happens when the stages start to unfold? Then it's like, okay, what the heck's going on? There's not supposed to be any stages. Like I was a little confused early on because I started witnessing, and that was supposed to mean this other thing that it didn't.
So maybe concepts are okay if you take them lightly.
Yeah, you take them lightly. It's like a map. A map can be very useful when you're going to someplace new, and when you get there, you put it down. But you deny a person a map because it might whatever.
Or because it doesn't, because a map of Montana doesn't actually resemble the way Montana's going to look when you get there.
Yeah. Or you use Google Street View and you discover that it's a little bit off, and the dentist was actually half a block down. It's kind of, so yeah, it can still, it's not like it's a perfect answer. And I remember Lauren saying that our concepts of enlightenment can be one of the last barriers to it, especially with people who've been on the path for a long time and have really have studied this stuff more formally. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be aware of the process. And there's actually in the 7th mandala, the Rig Veda, there's a place where the sage Vasishta mentions the importance of desiring unity once self-realization happens. But how are we going to desire unity if we don't know it's there?
It exists, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing, is you need to understand that there's a process and there's distinct stages. How you're going to experience it will vary. An example I use sometimes is puberty. Puberty, there's a standard process that happens for everybody, but different people will experience it very differently. And sometimes it's the quiet little thing, and sometimes it's more challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I was just talking to a friend today about how it seems that so many people have a certain sort of awakening and reach a sort of a stage and feel like they're done. there's something so gratifying
Oh, yeah.
or self-sufficient about whatever they are experiencing that they feel like, well, this is it. It couldn't be anything more than this.
No, I experienced that myself.
Yeah.
It's like the seekers died. I feel complete. I'm infinite. I'm liberated. It's like, what more could there be?
Yeah.
Like everything.
Right. So,
But yeah.
so it's good to know that,
there's more.
Keep
so
on
that's,
going.
that's a phase. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's like a phase. It's like.
I think what people kind of react to is that to forever follow the dangling carrot, that can sort of be
Yeah.
You can sort of deny yourself the appreciation of to the degree to which you've actually already arrived.
Yeah, and earlier I talked about the stages of bliss thing too, and lots of people will go through a fairly long, protracted process after a shift where there isn't bliss. It's just this, unpacking, clearing house process that goes on for a while, and sometimes people look at enlightenment as some kind of escape from their life. But it's the opposite, actually. It moves you much more fully into your life. Because you can't wake up unless you're willing to be here and be present to it and be willing to face what's here.
Yeah.
And otherwise, it just doesn't work. So so there's all kinds of, I remember I decided to write a post one time, I think, like 108, anyways, the myths of enlightenment. There's a whole long, I can't remember, a whole long
About
list
what it is.
about what it's not.
What it's not.
It's not this, it's not this. Well, like one good example is that I want to wake up. But you will never wake up. The person doesn't
Right.
wake up. The ego doesn't wake up. The person wakes up from the ego.
Right.
It's the self that wakes up and wakes up from the ego. So and yet for many, many years of my life, I was wanting to become enlightened,
Yeah. Damn it, I'm gonna bust a gut trying.
Yeah, and darn if it turned out that was a mistake.
Yeah.
I'm never going to get enlightened.
You mentioned Lauren a lot of times, Lauren and Lucia, and you and I are here to do a retreat with them. How many retreats have you done with them? Maybe a dozen, 20?
Yeah, I don't
Over the
know.
years?
I don't know.
Quite a few.
Yeah, a dozen or so. I
Yeah.
don't know. I've lost track.
And
But,
so,
yeah.
as much as you've progressed, which seems to be to a very significant degree, you still find value in coming back to these retreats.
Oh, yeah.
Is it because you just want to get a nice deep rest, or do you feel like there's yet more to appreciate or unfold?
There's definitely more to
these
unfold.
retreats are conducive to that.
I'm not finished.
Yeah.
'Cause one of the things is with the
Is
Brahman,
anyone ever finished?
well, in this time, not really. There isn't enough time to finish because once you have the Brahman shift, you're done with stages of development in consciousness. There is no longer
And then what?
that. But the refinement side, that's essentially could go on for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So it's essentially an indefinite process.
So consciousness itself doesn't develop anymore, but the apparatus through which consciousness lives
and it becomes
life
more
can
integration,
be more and more refined.
more integration, more embodied, more refined.
Subtle-
the
more
whole
subtle
process,
perception,
the
more
whole
subtle-
process.
yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. This some of this stuff I've had no idea. I mean, like you've heard of the absolute body,
Yes.
the term,
Yeah.
So it's like this for me. This body is not an individual body anymore. It's an absolute body, and there's this process that's taken place where, and guided by the forms of God, where certain things have gifts have been given. I don't know if you want to call it that. Things have been arranged, organized, and then certain laws of nature woken up. Like there's a cognitory process there, where the law of nature is woken up, and then it's blended with other existing awake laws and created this new synergy. And that now is part of the process of me living this life, where, I mean, I walk around and I'm doing things and I'm still, living a householder's life and all that kind of thing, but behind that is a whole other process taking place that's completely unrelated to this apparent form and the activity, but there's this process of processing creation going on all the time now in the background.
So earlier you were talking about like the 5 koshas, and it's like subtle bodies.
Well, there's 7 actually.
Seven koshas and so on.
Yeah.
And I'm just using that as an analogy now.
Yeah.
So when you mention absolute body, I mean, this body is aging and will probably die in 20, 30, 40 years or whatever.
The surface value of it is subject to karma and that whole thing.
But there's but you're saying there's an absolute body, which
is behind the cosmic. Yeah, it's like.
Is that in a sense more your real body? I mean, do you sort of, I hate to use the word identify, but do you identify with that body more than this one?
No, it's just like, it's there. This is here. There's the other kosha layers are here. There's this mind and intellect that are very active and blah blah. And
so what will happen when this body drops off?
Then I take a step back.
And is there still a vehicle of some sort?
Yeah.
Even though you would, you don't want to say I am enlightened, but even though you are a liberated being, let's say, there's still a vehicle once this body drops off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the nature and purpose of that vehicle is?
One of the interesting things about this, like I mentioned about time a little bit before, is time is like a dimension in sense of space. It's forward and backwards, and I know something of the future as well. Not sort of like what's going to happen tomorrow, that kind of thing, but more like the broader future.
Not like where the stock market's going to be in a week or something.
Yeah, no, it's not that kind of detail. But because my consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, the thing is higher than, it's distorted.
Say that again?
Well, the consciousness is continuing to evolve, so at that point in the future, it's distorted. So it's hard to grok what
exactly because you're not in that state of consciousness yet.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this reality taking place, and it's like, and so I have this sense of it, and for me now I understand why this unfolding is taking place. It's not actually even for this lifetime. It's for later on. And this is kind of like a training ground where I can kind of clean up the karma and have these shifts so that it's established and I can carry that forward. So yeah, it's funny, I mean, most of the time, most of my friends, I don't talk like this. So most people I know, we talk about the movies or good restaurants or whatever like that, and it's just I have a normal life. It's even people that are quite close to me, often I don't get into a lot of this stuff because this is so abstract and.
Well, me, this is all I'm interested in. I also like movies and restaurants stuff.
Yeah, no, it's pretty wild. I mean, in some ways, I mean, it's just kind of this process that's been unfolding, and over time, I'm less and less in the process. It's just taking place, And so there's just this unfolding. Oh, what surprise will come up today, or what will happen now? What will unfold now? And it's interesting too, because when I describe that shift with the new law of nature coming online, this isn't a local thing. It's happening cosmically, right? And so this is taking place. This is shifting the creation as a whole. It's taking place on that level. So there's this person having this experience here, and this apparent absolute body moving through itself and shifting itself. And it's like, but it's taking place on a cosmic level, so it's doing that on all the levels that are expressed from that.
I don't totally understand that, but I don't know if I want
it's hard to describe. But it's interesting because it's taking place, because for me it's like a marker for what's taking place in the evolution of group consciousness. And that's a useful thing to make a note of, by the way.
Well, maybe you're kind of an outlier, and there are other people who are going through similar shifts, and all are sort of being in some sort of training or preparatory phase for what is to come.
Yeah, and that's happening. And I've become more conscious of that over time. So it's not a.
So you're not one of these people who wants to just sort of be out of here and get off the wheel and never exist in any way, shape, or form again. you sense, I think, that
Yeah.
there's a role yet to play,
Yeah.
and you're willing to play it, and happy to play it. And
Yeah, no, it's interesting actually. There's a Jyotish, it's a Vedic astrology thing where you talk about your stuff, and you know they in there they can talk about your expected time of death, and it's interesting. They told me that I'll have a choice, and to when my karma is done, to be done with it, or to continue on. So it'll be interesting.
not
to
to
see what
continue
happens.
on this body, but
Not
continue
to continue on
on.
this body. Yeah.
You think?
Who knows?
Like
I'll
you
see
could
what
live to be
happens.
300 if you wanted to, or something?
I don't know. Beyond reckoning is what they said,
Huh.
but I don't know what that means. It's just, you know, it's like one of those sort of things. Like
Who told you this?
Jyotish. Well, two Jyotishis
Some
actually told me
Jyotishis.
this at different times.
Well, we'll
Yeah,
see.
but we'll see. It's
There are not
like
too many examples of that.
yeah. So, well, but we're in a time where things are changing
It's true.
a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's really important to understand with this too is it's an inside-out process. So it's taking place in consciousness and moving forward gradually. And so, the last place you see it is on the surface.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's not, for a lot of people, it looks like things are going south really badly
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. And certainly there's a call, you know, some things are being pushed to the surface to be seen and taken care of. But it's actually a sign of purification, of cleaning out, not of not end times.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, I was just talking to Canella last night, and we were talking about how these things keep happening, like the shooting in Ferguson, Missouri, and that becomes a whole consciousness-raising thing about Black Lives Matter, or you know, something happens with gay rights or something, and that shifts the culture. The culture seems to be shifting with greater and greater rapidity.
Exactly.
And these different events that come up seem to be catalysts for that.
Yeah.
And so, and the way that all relates to this conversation, I believe, is that, you know, there's a huge spiritual awakening taking place in the world, and
Yes.
and
it's
it's not just a
astonishing.
matter of cultural changes or attitudes about, you know, black people or gay people or whatever. There's something much more fundamental than that taking place.
Oh yeah, and it's so astounding. I mean, I spent all this time, you know, on a spiritual path. For a long time, I could count on one hand the number of people I had met that were awake in any kind of way, and so often the stories about somebody being awake turn out to be, you know, well, they had some good experiences, for a little while, but now it's just a whole different thing. It's like, I mean, you've got your show with all these people that have come on it, you know, various stages of development and that, but and you know, dozens of people I know, and these retreats too. You know, when I first started coming on the retreats, there was a few people who had shifted, and then now the majority usually it has shifted in some way, and there's people at all different stages now. So it's this complete diversity, and so even just sitting having a meal on the retreat is like the presence is just really it's really nice.
Yeah. So I don't know yet whether I'm going to interview Lauren and Lucia. Lauren doesn't want a big, huge wave of publicity and interest, but just the fact that I'm doing this interview and I'll be interviewing Claire Blanchflower after this, he's going to get some publicity whether he likes it or not. And so people are going to be interested. Who is this Lauren guy? You know, and where are these retreats? And how do I get into them? So I guess the one question is, you know, you and I have a TM background. Probably a lot of people on these retreats do, but a lot of people who are listening to this interview are not going to have had one. And so how relevant would all this be to them?
Oh yeah, Lauren when he first started out, you know, he had TM terminology was what he was familiar with, but he's become much more, over time, much more generic terms and stuff like that, moved away from that a lot. And certainly, you know, the people who know him and are friends of friends and stuff that made these connections, a lot of people have TM backgrounds on the retreats, but it's by no means everybody, not at all. And there's quite a diversity, and there's people you'll find from...
Claire doesn't have a TM background, does she?
No, and actually she learned TM after her later shift as well.
Okay.
So it's like some people are waking up and then learning TM or not.
Right.
They just have their
Do you see that in terms of the track record of people awakening, that the TM people have some kind of advantage, or really not?
Well, people who have been meditating for a long time have pros and cons, because they've got a lot of more clarity usually, so the shift is clearer, but they also can have stronger concepts and are more kind of like seeing everything going on and kind of like, so the ego is kind of like trying to manage things,
trying to fit everything, shoehorn everything into the structure that they've so carefully
but
built.
It's just also, but one of the things about the ego is it's like when you start seeing seeing past, the ego doesn't want you to see through the ego, because once you see past it, once you see through it, it's toast.
Game is over.
Yeah. So there's kind of like this dance that can happen, and one of the ways it does that is with concepts, and it kind of dances this stuff up and does this la 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 thing whenever you try and some insight comes through, and then it's like, blah, and goes on. So yeah, it's a little dance that happens sometimes in that approach, and so that clarity can be very helpful, especially after the shift, because then you can move through it quickly. But it can be a little bit more challenging to make the shift itself when there's that kind of that clarity too. So that's where this is really helpful too, because when you're in a group like this, being with the awake, then the awakeness is more lively.
Yeah.
So it's easier for that awakeness to happen in a lively place. So
I hope I do get to interview Lauren, because I think it'll be interesting, especially if we do it at the end of this weekend and I've gone through the whole experience. Because when you say people who have shifted, I don't even know if I count myself among them. I've certainly undergone huge transformations over the decades, and if I were to describe my experience to you, there's a lot of stuff that I think you'd find interesting and significant, but I'm just not sure what is meant anymore by a shift, because it's like if someone asked me if I'm awake, my answer would probably be, well, I'm awaker than I used to be, and probably less awake than I will be. It's these two ways, but there has been no
the oozer, people that kind of oozes through.
There's been no
process.
grand, irreversible watershed moment,
Right. Yeah, like I described.
Which may
really
be described as the Makara thing.
For me, but macro, that was.
But I don't feel like I'm falling back anymore. Into,
Well, my shift was quite distinct as well. But it's one of the things. Like I mentioned, the 5 ways that happens, and one of them is just kind of like this gradual process, and eventually, somewhere down the road, you kind of realize, I'm not falling back. It's here all the time. There's this continuity of awareness. I just am, and I'm not being caught by stuff so much anymore. And it's just kind of a more gradual.
All that describes my experience, and yet I don't think I have lucid dreaming, at least not consistently. As far as I know, I'm not witnessing 24/7.
But you go on long courses where you get into go deep and
go more rested.
Go more rested. Yeah. You're much more likely to get the clarity on a long course. Yeah.
Anyway, but it's fine. But on the other hand, I don't really care, because I'm enjoying the whole unfoldment, and I don't have any sort of burning desperation to be to point X by such and such a time or anything. I'm happy to sort of let it unfold as it unfolds.
Yeah. That's a good approach to take.
Yeah.
And we all have our own different processes and stuff, and look what you're doing, and really overtly in the world, and bringing this out to so many people.
Yeah,
it's
perhaps a fair dose of ignorance is useful in this capacity, so as to be able to ask the right questions or something.
It's one of the things about, I remember there was one point going along, I could not remember what it was like to have an ego. It was just like, it's like, it was gone, So there was no reference point for that, and in a sense of being identified with it. I mean, actually, that's something I should clarify too, because it's not that I experienced a sense of ego death in this process, but it's not that actually the ego itself that dies. It's the identification with the ego that ends, that breaks up. And you're still a person here that has preferences and habits and tastes, whatever like that.
Sure.
But it's just that's not the center anymore. It's just like your little thumb or something, or that's baby finger. So.
Alrighty. Well, a lot of times, when I interview somebody, they are a teacher, they're doing satsangs, they're doing Skype consultations, they've written a book, and you only kind of would touch on one of those points, which is that you're writing a book, and it will be available sooner or later, eventually.
Process.
I mean, do you have any inclination whatsoever to interact with people in Skype consultations, for some compensation or whatever?
I don't know. I have never considered it. I don't. Yeah.
Not really your thing.
Yeah, I'm
Or
a
you-
writer, so
Yeah.
I have my blog and I write there, and
Yeah.
and now I'm compiling the core stuff for the stages process to understand
Mm-hmm.
the different stages and the underlying process and the variations. That's kind of what I'm working on.
Can people submit questions through your blog if they
Yeah,
like you to write about something, for instance, and they have
Sure.
a question? Then you can.
Yeah.
I noticed a lot of times in our interaction between you and I and some other friends that's been grist for the mill, in a sense,
Oh, yeah,
giving
yeah.
you something interesting to write about.
Exactly,
on your blog.
yeah, and just responding. There's a few discussion groups I chat in sometimes, and
Yeah.
and sometimes something comes out that's like, oh, that's interesting. Because one of the things for me is I actually learn by the writing process, because it's like writing through me. So it's kind of like,
Yeah.
so I kind of write something and then it's like, oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Like, well, that cognitions thing I wrote recently, the 3 stages of cognition. I didn't know that.
Huh.
It just kind of came out. And I realized, oh yeah, that was that stage and that was that stage. And,
Yeah.
kind of-
I should
So-
mention actually that Buddha at the Gas Pump there's a Yahoo group associated with it, and you can find a link to that on the Batgap site. It's down on it's kind of obscure. It's down. You have to scroll down. It's in the right-hand column someplace. But David is very active in that Yahoo group, and just recently the whole group seems to have become a bit more active. So if people would like to sort of engage in conversations with you, that might be one place where they could
Yeah.
do so.
And I have a comment form on
On your
on
Davidya.
not comment form, what do you call it? Contact form on the vidya.ca website. So people can email me. It depends on what it's about. I mean, I have expertise in this process, but not in other areas so much.
Yeah. Okay. So you don't see yourself in any kind of a teaching role at this stage in your life or anything like that?
Well, for me, it's like I'm living the life, and what am I being called to do? And I'm being called to write, so I'm writing, and kind of like seeing where life goes.
Yeah.
And it kind of goes in interesting directions. It's sort of I'm making choices and decisions like any householder, but at the same time, there's this deeper flow that's coming through my life that is taking it in directions that are not planned or whatever. It's just kind of surprise.
Yeah.
Like I now live on the island, and various things have shifted that I didn't anticipate. But yeah.
You'll be speaking at the SAND conference. David and I are both going to be sharing the same time block at the Science and Non-Duality conference in late October. First I'll speak, and then I'll introduce David, and then he'll speak. We each have about 40 minutes or so.
Yeah. And I'll be speaking on the stages. That's kind of it's an important message, I think, in that environment, just to get that process. So when you're looking at these old texts, or where a teacher is speaking, where they're speaking from, like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Good. All right. Well, anything you want to add in conclusion at this stage? Obviously, there's always more to say, and you write all kinds of things, and people can subscribe to that. But have we covered everything that you consider to be important in this context?
No.
No.
We could go on for hours. So.
Yeah, we could. Yeah.
There's so much to it. It's a big arena.
Yeah, it's funny. I did an interview one time about a year ago with someone, and her basic point was, "I don't exist. I'm not a person." And whatever I asked, that would be the basic answer. And after, it was the shortest interview I ever did. After a little while, I thought, well, I guess there's nothing more to talk about here. But what I appreciate about what your orientation, which some people from that perspective might consider much too complicated and nuanced and detailed, and what is all that stuff? I just want to not exist, and I'm not a person. But
a lot simpler.
But it is. But I don't think it's not the end of the line either for her or anyone.
Yeah.
I just think that the course of evolution is vast and multifarious, and I really appreciate the sort of degree to which you have come to experience and understand it, and it's fulfilling for me to talk with someone who has that orientation. Not that I myself have traversed it to that extent, certainly not, but I know that the territory exists, and so it's interesting to talk to someone who has explored that territory in greater detail than I have. And I think it helps the spiritual culture, as I was saying earlier, in understanding that simplicity is good, but being simplistic is not. And if we're really interested in understanding reality, then we should be willing to accept that, what is it Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions, that reality is far more multifarious and mysterious and detailed and vast than our little concepts might have done justice to.
Yeah, yeah. It's an astonishingly large place. And I'm sure there's aspects I've never run into or whatever. Every so often I read somebody else talking about something and it's like a whole other side of it that I'd never noticed.
Yeah. So it's great fun to, what could be more interesting? What way to spend one's life could be more fascinating?
It's certainly been an adventure.
Yeah. Great. Well, let me wrap it up then, because we could go on and on, but I think I'm going to do another interview in a few minutes if Claire has arrived. So the sun's coming out. Might have to wear the sunglasses for the next one, but as you know, you've been listening to an interview on Buddha at the Gas Pump with David Buckland, and there have been many of these interviews so far, 300 and something, and there will hopefully be many, many more. So if you'd like to sort of check out ones done previously, go to batgap.com, explore the past interviews menus, some of which David was very instrumental in developing for me. There's a whole categorical index that he created for the site. And check out other aspects of the site. It's all pretty self-explanatory. There's I never fail to mention the donate button, because my engagement into this, as extensive as it is, wouldn't be possible without the support of appreciative viewers. If you'd like to, so I've had people notify me in the last few weeks saying, "What happened to you? All right, you haven't been posting any interviews lately." There's a thing where you can sign up to be notified by email each time there's a new interview. Some lady said, "I come to the site every day and there's no new interview." You don't have to do that. You sign up for the thing to be notified when there's a new interview, and you'll get an email when it's posted. So that menu is there. There's an audio podcast, because many people don't like to sit in front of their computers any more than they already do, so you can just listen to this in audio. There's a subscribe page for that lets you sign up on iTunes or Android or different devices. And there's some other stuff. Check out the menus. In fact, there's things that David helped me develop. He even helped put up a page where we have a Batgap theme song ringtone for your phone, and a screensaver, and all kinds of stuff. Maybe I'll have you working on the T-shirt next. So thanks for listening. Pardon? So thanks for listening or watching. It's really been a joy talking with you, David, and we'll do more. And to those watching, we'll see you in the next one.